Hello and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper along with Tribune football beat writer Dave Matter. Dave, Missouri coming off a 69-0 victory over Western Illinois, which we're not going to talk about. No. And we're going to move right along to the Oklahoma game. To begin with, Oklahoma number one in the nation. They come off a 23-13 victory over the number 5 team in the nation on the road. So obviously typical or better than typical Oklahoma team. Let's look at Missouri's offense versus Oklahoma's defense first. Oklahoma stifles Florida State pretty well. Maybe what way do you think Missouri matches up well against them, or do they at all?
Well, I don't know if they do. I mean, I think the one kind of knock on this Oklahoma team, or the one thing people were a little bit skeptical about was its defense, because last year they were kind of unstoops-like. They weren't a very good defense, at least not to the standard that Oklahoma is used to. And they lost some pretty good players, too. But then so far this year, just through 2 games at least, and the big test down in Florida State, I mean, this defense looked like a typical Bob Stoops defense. I mean, they were really good against the run. I think Florida State averaged about a yard a carry, got 6 sacks, intercepted a bunch of passes. Just a very dominating performance by their defense against a pretty quality offensive team in Florida State. So it's a huge challenge for Missouri. I think it's a big challenge for their offensive line. I mean, they have to protect James Franklin. They have to develop some balance, and that's with getting the running game going, find some lanes for Henry Josie. I don't think it's going to be easy for Missouri at all. Maybe not as easy as it was last year, because at times I think Missouri won the line of scrimmage against Oklahoma here in Columbia, and it just looks like this is a different type of Oklahoma defense this year around.
Oklahoma is a team that usually has been able to pressure Missouri's quarterbacks with just their front four. Last year, not really so much the case. They didn't get much heat on Blaine Gabbert, and that's why he was able to go down the field. This year, their defensive line, are you thinking they're more of a traditional OU defensive line where they're going to be able to heat up Missouri pretty well just from those four?
Seems that way so far, at least. You know, they kind of mix and match between a 3-man front and a 4-man front last year. I think this year Missouri's got a pretty good idea of what they're doing. But they had, they got Travis Lewis back last week, the All-American linebacker, so he's a guy that can bring pressure as a blitzer. So they have a lot of weapons on that side of the ball, and the one good thing going for Missouri, I think, is that they've already been at least in one kind of hostile environment when they went to Arizona State a couple weeks ago, and James Franklin played really well against a defense that pressured him a lot. So he's at least got that one game on the resume that he can kind of bank on for the experience factor. But it's not going to be easy by any means.
Then the other side of the ball, last year Missouri held them in a decent check, Oklahoma. I think Broyles was maybe a little banged up in that game, but they didn't let him run wild on them. This year, you've got obviously Landry Jones and Ryan Broyles and all sorts of weapons over there. Just how you think Missouri's defense then now matches up with Oklahoma?
Well, the tough matchup there is Oklahoma runs so many plays. I mean, they get a first down, they put the ball back on the line of scrimmage, and they go. I mean, you cannot afford any kind of communication breakdowns in the secondary, which we've seen from Missouri's defense in the past. Not so much last year. Seemed like a little bit at that Arizona State game. They had some trouble back there in the back end. It's hard to substitute just because the plays go so fast. So they have to be really good on first and second down and try to put Oklahoma State in some tough situations on third down, and just try to make life difficult for Landry Jones. You got to get pressure on him, which they did a decent job of last year, especially in the fourth quarter when Missouri clinched that game here in Columbia. So nothing's going to be easy against this team for sure, because they are protecting Jones better. Also, it seems like this year than they were a year ago. But one thing Cornell Ford, Missouri's cornerbacks coach, told me yesterday was his defensive guys, they cannot afford to celebrate a play. They can't afford to mope after a play, because you just don't have time back there, because they run so fast. So Missouri probably can't get too cute, too creative in its coverages and things that are doing. They just have to play pretty fundamental defense and just move on to the next play, because there's going to be a lot of them coming their way.
Odds makers not giving Missouri much of a chance, a 21-point underdog, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, the biggest topic that continues to dominate the conversation is realignment. It looks like Oklahoma has pretty much got their heart set on leaving, at least if we believe the comments from Oklahoma President David Bourne on Monday. As we tape this on Tuesday, it would appear that the options for Missouri, if the Big 12 were to dissolve, would be A, the SEC, which it sounds like there's at least a certain amount of interest there from the SEC. B would be some sort of combination of the Big 12 and Big East, which I personally think would be total fallback if everything else does not work out, but we're not quite sure how Brady Deaton's thinking on that one. And then maybe third is if the SEC's interest in Missouri, whether it's high, low, or non-existent, would somehow spur the Big Ten into action, and then the Big Ten might be interested in expanding, which I think would be the most palatable to Missouri officials. Let's get your take on that, where you think they might land, where they should land, and then maybe what effect is that going to have on football and, right down the line from recruiting to competitiveness to kind of long-term results.
Right now, it does seem like there's the most buzz about the SEC. It figures that they want to go to 14 members, Texas A&M being the 13th. I think Missouri has a lot of factors that would be attractive to the SEC, the two big TV markets in St. Louis and Kansas City, which are pretty much untapped by the SEC right now. I think the academic reputation is pretty good being an AAU member. And just the quality of the program, the fact they've been competitive the last 8 years under Gary Pinkel for the most part, makes them an attractive choice. But for Missouri, is the SEC the best option? Well, if it's the most viable option, it's the best option at this point, especially if the Big 12 is going to fall apart. We've said it before on here, it's a meat grinder of a schedule because of the top 25 every week is just full of teams from the SEC. They play a little bit different style of football down there. You see teams like Oregon, which I think kind of compare to Missouri as far as the style of offense, have really struggled against teams from the SEC. But those are the top teams they've struggled against. I think Missouri can be more competitive with the middle-of-the-road teams in the SEC, the teams at the bottom.
In fact, they have. I mean, Pinkel's 4-1 against SEC. So.
Right. So, they would be, if they were in a West Division, they'd compete against the two Mississippi schools, which I think they can compete with on the field. Arkansas is a top 10 team, but, Missouri's beaten them before, and I think they can be competitive with them, and a good rivalry, I think, can develop there. It's
Kentucky. I think Missouri's clearly a better program.
Sure, absolutely. They play Vanderbilt sometimes. Everyone's better than Vanderbilt for the most part every year. But it won't be easy. But the easiest path is not necessarily always the best path. I think Missouri's program would get a bump in a lot of different areas by joining the best conference in the country. I think fan interest would go up. I think their recruiting would probably get a bump. If they can maintain their foothold, if you want to call it that, in Texas. I think more kids might be interested in playing for a team that gets to play against Alabama and LSU and Florida and Georgia. So I think there's a lot of upside to joining the best conference in the country, especially just the stability. And Missouri hasn't been in a conference that's had that kind of stability and the revenue too, obviously.
Okay, then maybe look at the Big Ten if that were to be a possibility.
Well, I think the Big Ten makes a lot of sense also. I think it just seems at least likely at this point. But I think the academic culture there fits Missouri. The geography, I think, makes a little bit more sense. You have a little bit more natural rivalries with teams like Iowa and Nebraska and Illinois. And then I think just the competitive side, I think Missouri's got a better chance of winning the Big Ten, or at least being one of the top teams in the Big Ten. At least, if you look at the Big Ten the last 10 years or so compared to the SEC. But it does just seem like Big Ten had its chance with Missouri a year ago, passed on Missouri in favor of Nebraska. So you wonder, would they just be expanding for the sake of expanding if they would want to include Missouri again? You always got to wonder about Notre Dame too. Do the Big Ten really want to expand unless Notre Dame's in the plans? I don't know. So we'll see. But there just doesn't seem to be as much buzz with the Big Ten lately, and Missouri, or anybody for that matter. But that's kind of how they operate up there. They're very conservative. There's not a lot of leaks. Nebraska kind of popped up out of nowhere, a little over a year and a half ago or so. So we'll see.
Then lastly, some sort of amalgamation of the leftover Big East and Big 12 teams.
I don't think that conference, that's assuming Texas leaves, and
right.
It's the 5 teams left over from the Big 12 and the 5 or 7 teams left from the Big East. I don't know if that even registers as a BCS viable conference. I just don't. I mean, West Virginia is a legit top 25 team. Missouri usually is. Other than that, you've got kind of an upstart Baylor program. You've got Kansas and Kansas State have been struggling. Iowa State's, kind of up and down, but their ups aren't too high. And then you've got some Big East programs that I don't think Missouri fans would be too interested in going to see.
TCU might be the best program out of the whole bunch.
TCU, yeah, and they're going to join the Big East next year, presumably. But I just don't see much there. I don't think you fill Memorial Stadium very often against that schedule. I don't think fans want to travel to those Big East programs like that. You maintain your rivalry with Kansas and Kansas State, but is that really worth it to be in a lesser conference that's just not going to generate much excitement locally or nationally? I don't think.
I think, and beyond that, that's the big pool of teams that are going to be picked apart every time another. I mean, it might be, you might talk about, okay, we're all going to do this and we're going to be together on this, and then if the Pac-14 or the SEC comes and offers one of these schools, they're probably going to go, and you're right back in the same thing.
Absolutely.
Recruiting-wise, I think it's going to be interesting because the big question back when the Big Ten was being discussed last year was what would it do to recruiting in Texas? I might maintain that Texas, if Texas goes to the Pac-16 or 14 or 12, and Texas A&M goes to the SEC, I think Texas is becoming so fragmented in what they're paying attention to that I don't know that there's going to be one conference they pay attention to more than the other. So that may allow you to remain in Texas and recruit regardless of where you go, I think.
Sure, and I talked to one of the Missouri coaches yesterday kind of about that topic, and they kind of see things the same way. I mean, the state's going to be so divided. And let's face it, Missouri is generally recruiting against Baylor, Texas Tech, TCU for a lot of their kids from Texas. They're not going up against the Longhorns very often. And where is Baylor, TCU, where are they going to end up in all of this? They seem even less certain than Missouri at this point. So I think they'll still be able to do what they do. I think anybody that says, a kid from Texas won't go to the Big Ten because that's this tenet that everyone kind of believes in. Well, I think all those old rules are going to be thrown out the door if the whole map is redrawn. And I think kids are going to maybe even pay less attention to the conferences because there's not going to be such a big difference between them all because there's only going to be 4 of them anyway. So who knows? We're all just guessing.
Who knows is a good way to end this podcast.
Yeah.
Next week we'll be back to talk about Missouri's game at Oklahoma State or at Oklahoma, and possibly talk about what conference Missouri is in.
Yeah.